to be honest, actually, Israel has always relied on that kind of power, that violent dominatory power since its very founding. You know, the Nakba was all about demonstrating not just to Palestinians, but to surrounding states that they have the power and that everyone should be afraid of them. And in many ways, the kind of violence that we're seeing now, both in Gaza, but also in the surrounding states, particularly Lebanon at the moment, comes out of the fear of Israel that October 7 diminished their kind of deterrence, their sovereign dominatory power that they used to terrify everyone into submission.
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and even good night to any of the audience members who are going to watch this podcast from wherever they are in this world. My name is Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, and this is Middle East Insights platform that is going to talk today about dehumanization of Palestinians when the threshold has been crossed, and the dehumanization of Palestinians in West Bank, Gaza, and how it is going to impact. At the same time, we are taking cognizance of the fact that yesterday, by the IDF strike and elimination process, the General Secretary of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, was eliminated. That is the Western narrative of calling the elimination. On the other side, the countries like Iran, Iraq, even Lebanon, Palestine, consider it a martyrdom and the fact that his sacrifice will not go to waste. Over the period of time, a lot of leaders of Hezbollah have been assassinated. Fuad Shukr, even the leader who was involved in the ceasefire deal of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, has been assassinated. We do not know what happened to Ibrahim Raisi, particularly. But over the period of time, the assassinations have become a norm of dealing with non-state actors, intervening in the sovereignty of some other country, not following the international law and the repercussions of it, while the Israeli hostages, the innocent victims, are still not home. So what has happened is that over the past, Israelis are committing domicide, actually, in Lebanon by randomly targeting civilian areas. At the same time, that 6 buildings with civilians, residents which were inside Lebanon were blown. European Union's Joseph Borrell said that no country is capable of stopping Israelis because no one can say anything apart from please. Hezbollah later then clarified after IDF that Hassan Nasrallah had been assassinated, though the Shiites in Lebanon are very ambiguous when it comes to assassination, and they see it as a form of reappearance in religious linguistics of it. At the same time, the Israeli troops desecrated Al-Athar Mosque in Rafah in southern Gaza and blew it off. The Al-Mayadeen television anchor recently broke down to tears when she tried to broadcast what exactly is happening in Lebanon. 4 Palestinian people were killed by the Israelis when they fiercely displaced civilians in Al-Nusayrat refugee camp in central Gaza. At the same time, Israeli warplanes continue to launch massive airstrikes on Lebanon's capital, Beirut, as we speak right now. 2 days ago, Palestinian prisoner Walid Khalifa was shot and abducted by Israeli troops in a raid on his family home in Nablus. Israeli troops have yesterday opened fire on Palestinian civilians at the entrance of Al-Arub camp along the Al-Quds road in Al-Khalil governorate in Palestine. Netanyahu also, his office released a picture of him ordering a strike on Beirut yesterday by a telephone call from New York. At the same time, when Netanyahu got back to Israel, there was a certain kind of assassination attempt by the Houthis in Yemen over him. And this is something which is going to continue for a long time now. Rockets were, even after Nasrallah's death, fired to Lebanon. Even rockets were fired from Lebanon at an illegal Israeli settlement east of Jerusalem, which caused last night multiple power outages in the settlement area. At the same time, missiles launched from Lebanon, they struck on David Sling's air defense system of Israel that caused a media blackout in Israel yesterday. The Israelis targeted the Kunita family home at Al Jala Street in central Gaza City yesterday. Huge explosions were heard and seen at Konoko base, where American forces are stationed in northern countryside of Deir ez-Zor in Syria. And so, the conflict continues. We are at this point about to reach 1 year of the genocide. So, on behalf of us, we are very privileged to have the long, deep, strategic, objective insight of Dr. Richard Jackson, who is joining us live from New Zealand right now. And it is a matter of great pride for us to host him because of the legacy of work that he has done. And he'll help us to simplify these complicated issues, to make us understand, and to also understand what terrorism actually is in today's day and age. So with this, I would like to invite Fayaz, our volunteer, who would formally introduce Sir at this platform.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shubda Chaudhary. Hello, sir. Greetings and welcome to all of you on our online event that is Threshold Crossed, Dehumanization of Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank. It is an honor and privilege to present myself as an anchor volunteer at Middle East Insights platform, which is an online volunteer-driven community that exists without any kind of external funding to create an independent discourse in today's segmented world. I am Syed Mahmood Fayaz Mehdi. You can also call me as Fayaz, a postgraduate from Amity Institute of International Studies in the field of international relations. And now let me quickly introduce our speaker of today. It's again an absolute honor and a privilege to introduce a truly remarkable figure in the field of peace and conflict studies, Professor Richard Jackson. Professor Jackson currently holds the prestigious Leading Thinker Chair in Peace Studies at the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies and is an esteemed voice in critical terrorism studies globally. As the founding editor and editor-in-chief of the journal Critical Studies on Terrorism, he has shaped the field with his in-depth research and editorial leadership. His work goes beyond academia, having authored over 15 books and 100 journal articles, including influential texts like Revolutionary Nonviolence and Writing the War on Terrorism. His research spans from pacifism and nonviolence to the social construction of war and international conflict resolution, contributing profound insights into understanding and resolving global conflicts. With such vast contributions to the study of terrorism, peace, and nonviolence, we are privileged to have him with us today. Let's extend a warm welcome to Professor Richard Jackson. Over to you, ma'am and sir.
Okay. So thank you so much, sir. Let us start with the first question. And the first question, sir, is how do you define terrorism in today's day and age when the dynamics of international law in the global south, specifically, be it West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, have changed?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your very kind introduction and your very kind welcome. And I'm delighted to be on your program. I think you're doing great work over there, and yeah, I'm very happy to contribute. The question is a really important one and a very pertinent one, because terrorism actually is a highly contested term. What we've seen is, particularly since the war on terror began after 9/11 in 2001, but in fact, even going back earlier than that, from the early 1970s, terrorism was defined as something incredibly kind of like irrational and evil. It wasn't a form of political violence that was understandable, that was political, that was strategic, but it kind of got redefined in this way as something that could be used as a way of delegitimizing whoever was using that kind of violence. And what we've seen since that period, both pre and post 9/11, is particularly Western states dominating the discourse of terrorism and using that label to define not only non-state actors, so that the term is always used to define the violence by non-state actors. It's never applied to states, although sometimes they talk about state sponsors of terrorism, and that usually applies to the enemies of the West as well. But it's also been, defined as a particularly egregious and evil form of political violence, and a form of political violence that we can't possibly understand. And I mean, that has led to other misuses of the term as well. So it's come to be associated very strongly with Muslims, and the notion of Islamic terrorism, and notions around radicalization and violent extremism and so on, which are kind of associated terms. There's a whole language, a whole discourse around terrorism. And not only that, but that whole discourse has been codified in international law. So the whole sort of international legal structure has been kind of influenced by the war on terrorism. Now, what I would say is that one of the features of this discourse is that because terrorism is defined and understood as something that's evil and poses an existential threat, states have given themselves permission to use any means necessary to counter it. So during the war on terrorism, for example, the United States kind of redefined a lot of international legal norms, to do with torture, to do with targeted killings, but also to do with preemptive war. And they kind of bent the rules of international law a long, long way. And recent studies from the Brown University's Costs of War project, for example, show that somewhere around 4.5 million people died during the war on terror. So what we're seeing today with Israel and its response to both Hamas's attack on October 7, but also the armed response by Hezbollah in support of Palestine and trying to prevent the genocide, is using that same discourse to say these are such evil people and they pose such an existential threat that any means are necessary to deal with them. And so that's why we've seen, a huge bending, I would say breaking of international law, justified on the grounds that this is a legitimate counter-terrorist operation, that they're trying to destroy a very dangerous set of terrorist groups, evil terrorist groups. And this legitimizes all their actions. So to get back to your original question, we don't actually have a settled definition of terrorism, but the way states and the international community, particularly Western states, have defined it themselves has widespread consequences. Now, as a scholar, I would say there is a definition of terrorism, and that it's a form of violence that involves political communication. So it's kind of, in a way, it's symbolic. What you do is you kill one group of people, or even just one individual, in order to send a message to another group. So it's about trying to intimidate or terrify or coerce the group that's watching. It's not necessarily about choosing particular individuals, although in some cases it is, like Nasrallah, because he's a symbolic head. You'll hear Israeli politicians say this should be a message to any future leader of Hezbollah, or any leader of a group that opposes Israel should know that this is what we can do to you. In other words, we kill them so that we're sending a powerful message of terror to everyone else. And so if we use that definition of terrorism, that it's defined by the fact that its primary goal is to send a message to others, to try and coerce people through violence, then we have to say there is such a thing as state terrorism. And what we're seeing from Israel is very, very clearly state terrorism.
It also reminds me of before, the French Revolution, during the time of French monarchy. And as Foucault mentioned in his book, Discipline and Punish, that how, the body was used as a symbol of anyone who was committing crime, the body of them, the way they were dehumanized, the way they were paraded out naked and their organs were taken out and they were tied to the cart wheel and taken to every part of the city to show everyone and to instill fear.
Mm.
And that kind of, analysis on how the assassination of the heads of non-state actors has become slowly a norm. But at the same time, if there's an assassination of a state actor, it causes a massive hue and cry. Another parallel is also about the lives of, an American citizen or an Israeli citizen or British or a European citizen versus the lives of the citizens in the Middle East. So, irrespective of the fact that every human life is equal, the kind of hullabaloo that comes over, the death, or specifically when 9/11 happened, and, the impact of it, what is happening in Lebanon right now, what is happening in Gaza right now is at the same or even worse level. But that has not been equated. And that there's a silence regarding it. The second question, sir, is that how a conflict now, which is so disproportionate in its impact on civilians, be it in Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, be justified without a clear strategy? Where does it end? How does it end? What is the solution to it? Not every country in Middle East or West Asia can just be bombed and civilians have to become refugees, which later European Union doesn't want.
Yes, look, if I could sort of tie those two things together, the statement that you made about lives mattering and then also strategy. I mean, you're absolutely right. One of the things that we've seen, particularly since the war on terror, is kind of this reversion to a form of political power that is rooted in, violent, dominatory sovereignty, right? It's a kind of a brute force kind of power. The United States tried to impose its rule on the Middle East and to discipline those who resisted American hegemony in the Middle East through the application of extreme forms of violence, including, the kind of exactly what you were talking about before, the spectacle of Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, as well as the kind of drone killings and the videos that they were so proud of to demonstrate that the kind of the reach of this violent, dominatory, sovereign power. And To be honest, actually, Israel has always relied on that kind of power, that violent dominatory power since its very founding. You know, the Nakba was all about demonstrating not just to Palestinians, but to surrounding states that they have the power and that everyone should be afraid of them. And in many ways, the kind of violence that we're seeing now, both in Gaza, but also in the surrounding states, particularly Lebanon at the moment, comes out of the fear of Israel that October 7 diminished their kind of deterrence, their sovereign dominatory power that they used to terrify everyone into submission. That kind of breakout of the Gaza prison seemed to show that not only were they vulnerable, but that no, people weren't afraid to fight them. And so in many ways, the extreme, spectacle of violence that we're seeing at the moment is kind of Israel's attempt to re-establish its balance of terror, if you like, its deterrence against its enemies, based on this kind of, intense fear, right? Trying to make everyone so fearful that they will simply give in and submit to Israel's will. And in a way, what this tells us is that, the terror itself is the strategy. So we're not talking here about kind of rational military strategy, because if we were to analyze Israel's actions based on what we know from many decades of research into, military strategy, particularly suppression campaigns such as the one they're using against non-state groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, we would have to conclude that what they're doing is irrational because it's not going to work. It's never worked in the past. It's failed to, suppress these movements first. And then secondly, you can't eliminate these movements, even though they state that is the aim that they're trying to achieve. But in many cases, they're actually making those movements stronger by creating more martyrs, by creating more victims, by creating more suffering. I mean, it's very, very telling that I heard somewhere that something like 85% of the Hamas fighters who broke out on October 7 were orphans who had been made orphans from previous Israeli attacks. So how many orphans are there today in Gaza who will, volunteer to be Hamas fighters in the future? So any kind of rational assessment of Israeli strategy would say, we're doing things which have never worked in the past. So I don't know why we're doing it. And the same with killing leaders. Israel has been assassinating both Palestinian leaders, but also, leaders of militant groups in other places like Lebanon, since at least the 1940s, 1950s. It's never worked. It's not a strategy that has a history of working. Every leader that they've killed recently in Hezbollah has a deputy, and that deputy is simply going to step up into the new role, and they will appoint a deputy for themselves in case they're killed. I mean, so it might disrupt Hezbollah for, 6 months, maybe, could be less, but it's not going to make any material difference in the long term. Hezbollah will still continue to fight. So what is that strategy? It's not that rational. But if, as I said, the point is to terrify, that is the strategy. The strategy is to try and demonstrate with spectacular violence and reach and the ability to kill almost anyone and the willingness to kill almost anyone across the Middle East is meant to make everyone afraid and meant to reestablish Israel's power. Now, of course, that is also not a good strategy, and it doesn't work because, they've tried that many times before as well. And the reality is that because people are fighting what they see as a just cause, they're probably not going to be intimidated that way.
So, sir, in this context, how is United Nations, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, how are they functioning? Because Israel has completely stated that the Vienna Conventions does not apply to it. There's no office representing the rule-based order of the Vienna Convention or the Geneva Convention, in spite of the fact that now it has been clearly stated after so many years that West Bank and Gaza are illegally occupied territories. The kind of nonchalance of Israel. Now, I would like to differentiate here between Israeli state and the Israeli civilians. When I am speaking about Israel, I'm speaking only about the state and the war cabinet and not trying to hegemonize everyone. So the point is that how does international law now apply? Because nothing is being done. United Nations yesterday said that the bombing of Lebanon should be stopped. It has not.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is the question of our age at the moment, the question of the moment. And to be honest, I actually think that we've crossed, if we want to talk about thresholds, we've crossed some kind of threshold, which is that this whole entire crisis that's been going for a year has revealed, if you like, the kind of colonial hegemony of the existing so-called liberal world order. I mean, in a way, countries in the global south and people in the global south always knew that, for example, the International Criminal Court is only ever going to prosecute people of color. It's only ever going to prosecute Africans or, people who are not white. It's not going to, prosecute white people. And the International Court of Justice lacks any enforcement mechanisms. The United Nations was set up so that the great powers, particularly the kind of settler colonial states, can always veto. And then if you think about the World Bank and the IMF and the kind of international economic architecture, the whole system in many ways was designed to preserve the Western order, the Western kind of dominance of the international order. And what this particular crisis at the moment has revealed, not just to people in the global south, but to the entire world now, because it's on the news every day and it's on social media every day and we can see it. What it's revealed is that there are two standards. There is one standard for the rest of the world and one standard for the Western states. And they get to decide, which international law they want to apply. And you'll notice that they all joined in very strongly to support the ICC's warrants against Putin and Russian officials and the ICJ's, rulings about genocide in Ukraine and so on. So America's enemies, that's fine. But as soon as it started to be applied to Israel, the United States said, these institutions are wrong and we're going to sanction them and we're not going to follow them and so on. So they've revealed to the whole world that they don't really believe in the rule of law. They don't really believe even in the institutions that they set up. And they certainly don't believe in universal human rights. It's a settler colonial racist system that they preside over. And I think that what we're witnessing is the beginning of the end of that system, because I don't think it can survive, really. And I don't also see how the Western states can continue to lead what they call the liberal world order with any legitimacy or any real strength anymore, because I don't think anyone's going to follow them. Just a handful of states will continue to support them, but they're going to be increasingly isolated because, the whole world can see the hypocrisy of this order that's been established. And if we take it, if we try to trace through some of the kind of longer historical currents in this, what we can see is that it's a deeply racist system that goes back to colonialism, where Western settler colonial powers viewed non-Western people as inferior and uncivilized and needing a strong hand, needing to be guided by the enlightened West. And then there's also, if you tie into that, the dehumanization that's occurred through this discourse of terrorism and the war on terror, which has been going on for 24 years now. So that also says that anyone who opposes the West is a terrorist and kind of a non-human monster who needs to be eliminated, or, can be denied habeas corpus and have their rights taken away from them and illegally rendered, tortured, or drone striked without any, legal process. So, and that, fits in well with the deeper historical roots of the kind of racist coloniality of the international system and the so-called liberal world order. Now, it's a big revelation now to the rest of the world, but of course, if you lived in Indonesia or Africa or the subcontinent or anywhere else, you knew this already, right? Because the United States has been murdering millions of people for its own interests and helping other states murder millions of people, for 100 years now. But I think what's happened is it's come out into the open, and to use a kind of Western phrase, the emperor has no clothes. We can now see it. It's there for all to see. So, and one of the worries that I have is just that whenever a system like that begins to break down, it creates more instability. It creates a kind of power vacuum, and it creates the possibility of kind of more disorder and competition and conflict before a new order can emerge. And I think, we're in for a bumpy ride. We're in for a worrying period in the next, I think, probably just a few decades.
Yeah. In fact, what you said, sir, also reminds me of Wretched of the Earth, written by Frantz Fanon, in which there was one particular paragraph that caught my attention 10 years back. And this is that violence is a very pertinent form of virtue or trait in a master-slave relationship. Now, when the master goes away, when the colonizing master goes away, the violence is still as trauma imbibed by the body of those who are colonized or the slaves. They have to get it out. How do they get it out? They use that violence and they see the reflection of the master in each other. And that further creates a channel for them to bombard their violence, political, physical, emotional violence on each other instead of the real master who caused it at the first place. So this is also, how the entire, the West has been trying to sow the sectarian divide, that the Shias and Sunnis are not, together. The same kind of divide into the various kinds of ethnic diversity which are there in the Middle East. And there are so many. About Yazdis, about Druze, about the Kurds. And they have been, more than the colonial state apparatus, they have also been, these minorities have also been exploited by their own Arab authoritarianism, which is Arab and Persian and all of it. They have been, victims of that kind of political violence too. And this continues, the cycle of it. So, sir, as talking about dehumanization, what exactly is dehumanization?
So dehumanization is the process of assigning, non-human or animalistic characteristics to a group of other people based on some kind of commonality that they have. It's part of the psychology of in-groups and out-groups. So, an in-group will define itself in opposition to an out-group and will often try to dehumanize the out-group by trying to to assign them sort of characteristics that make them seem less than human, or in some ways it's not. I mean, we call it dehumanization, but sometimes it's a kind of negative humanization, because it says, for example, that, I mean, as Edward Said talked about in relation to Orientalism, this idea of, the Arab other as being cruel. They're cruel people, they're uncivilized, they're savages, and so on and so forth. Now, when you talk about cruelty, for example, that's a human characteristic. So even though it's a kind of a dehumanization, it's a dehumanization that occurs through assigning a negative human characteristic to a group. But on the other hand, there are a lot of ways in which dehumanization occurs, where you make statements about others, where you say, for example, this other group, they're used to suffering. They don't feel pain as much as we do. So it's not anything we really have to worry about it. They're used to that kind of poverty, or they're used to that kind of life. They're happy as they are. Or it might be, language that you use that completely dehumanizes them, where you refer to them as insects. So during the Rwandan genocide, for example, they called them cockroaches, the Tutsi. And then, you can use medical references and disease. You can call a certain group of people a scourge, or vermin, or something like that.
Human animals.
Human animals, exactly. And then, in the war on terror, and this is something that I examined in my book, Writing the War on Terrorism, where I looked at the language. They called them the faceless enemies of freedom. Now, the problem with all of this kind of dehumanization is that it can feed into processes that make it much easier to then enact forms of cruel treatment and lethal treatment of others. Because you've dehumanized them, you sort of stifle or push down your own sympathies, the natural sympathies that we all have for other human beings. And then if you reinforce those kind of practices with kind of material practices, that can also allow you to treat people in very cruel ways. I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is that, this metaphor of the faceless enemies of freedom, we saw that at Abu Ghraib, where you saw photographs of people with hoods on. And so that was kind of a materialization of that phrase. And it has a dual purpose, because one, it brings to life that phrase, where you can say, see, these are faceless enemies of freedom. But also, when you can't see a human face, and you can't see the emotions and the suffering, and you can't see their eyes and see their humanity, it makes it much easier to abuse them. So what we're seeing in the current context, but in actual fact, we have to say this dehumanization of Palestinians goes right back. It goes back to the very founding of the State of Israel, to the early Zionists who arrived in Israel and viewed the Palestinians living there as backward, as savages, as uncivilized. And in fact, Herzl and many of the other prominent Zionists there said, actually, we're doing a good thing, because we're going to bring European civilization to a backward people. They'll thank us. They'll be happy, because, we're helping them improve their race. And they followed very much the kind of British colonial language that had been used in many other places, including India, this kind of civilizing mission. But once the Palestinians started to resist, I mean, it then becomes a dehumanizing language of, they're a threat, they're a scourge, they're human animals, they're terrorists. which is again is a dehumanizing term. And all the way through the entire history of the Israeli state, we see terribly dehumanizing language used against Palestinians. And then that dehumanization extends to culture, and to certain practices where Palestinian history is devalued, their language is devalued, their religion is devalued, their culture is devalued. And in fact, there are attempts to erase all of that. And then on top of that, one way in which dehumanization is kind of reinforced is by creating practices of separation. And this is kind of the apartheid state that Israel has built, means that Palestinians and Israelis almost never, ever meet, except in the situation where Israeli soldiers are, beating, detaining, shooting, torturing, or abusing Palestinians in some way. But day to day, there are walls that separate them. There are checkpoints. They have different roads that they're allowed to travel on. They have different streets that they can walk along. And they have different schools. There are something like 85 cities and towns in Israel where Palestinians are not allowed to live. They create these exclusive zones, exclusive neighborhoods, through a whole series of interlocking laws. And all of that is designed to keep them separate, right? And that separation allows, in particular, the Israelis to completely dehumanize the Palestinians. Because when you don't meet them, when you don't humanize them through interaction, through conversation, through sharing meals or going to events together, or any kind of civil society interaction, it's much easier to say, oh, well, look, they hate us all. They want to kill us all. They're a threat to us. They're trying to take our land. And then we can bombard them. We can, deny them food, put a siege around Gaza, and it doesn't matter. You can just say, well, you can have no feelings towards them. Because that's what dehumanization does. It cauterizes your own empathy for the other. And Israel would not be able to do what it's doing without a massive project of dehumanization that it's taken, many, many decades to perfect, and which is really, really intensely felt in Israel. I mean, one of the things that you said was you wanted to make a distinction between the Israeli people and the Israeli state. Well, I would say, along with many others who are observing it, but the Israeli people have become extremely, they've become extremists, violent extremists, I would say. If you look at the polling data on how many of them support the war and think that it should be even more, and how many of them support the soldiers who torture Palestinians, the people who demonstrated to try and prevent Israeli soldiers from being prosecuted for torturing Palestinians, the settlers who are extremely, very extreme in their views, just the language of particularly those extreme right and extreme settler politicians. Like you mentioned, that talking about human animals and so on. I think the entire society has very much dehumanized Palestinians, and it's become, ingrained into the culture now in many ways. Certainly, the number of kind of Israelis who are committed to humanizing Palestinians and working for a peaceful future has shrunk to an almost imperceptible level.
Yeah. And even like we interviewed Mao Zedong, who is a peacemaker, and he stated that even the media does not give him space. In spite of the fact that he lost his parents during the Hamas attack last October, the media is not giving him space to put forward his thoughts. And at the same time, yesterday, for example, so I was at a TV debate when they were talking about this kind of, like carrying on with this dehumanization aspect. So one of the, experts from India specifically said that the only way to cut down this military funding is to, cut down this entire genocide, not exactly genocide because they don't want to use the term, but the only solution to this conflict right now is when the funding to Hezbollah, Hamas, by all the proxies and the states is cut. That is the only. And my intuitive visceral reaction was that right now the settlers in West Bank are getting enormous amount of money without the revelation of sources to buy guns and to be distributed to the settlers in West Bank.
Mm.
And even the settlers, so not the IDF, not even Mossad, the settlers who have taken over in West Bank are using violence against those, like in cities of Hebron, in Nablus, along with the army. So why does not one need to cut off the funding for them? That
Absolutely.
is, yeah. If you have to cut funding for every, so that the war, be it Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Palestine, doesn't become a business model that the arms companies and the lobbies feed on.
I mean, just to take this a little bit forward, I mean, there's quite a few prominent analysts, and I would count, the journalist Gideon Levy amongst them, who've long argued that the occupation, which is based on a dehumanization of Palestinians, is actually dehumanizing Israelis. And I'm saying that in a kind of substantive way. It's making them less empathetic, and it's making them more willing to commit violence, more willing to tolerate atrocities, more willing to excuse, genocide and denial of human rights and so on. It's making them less kind of full of human values as a society. And that's because every, Israeli person of the age of consent has to go and serve in the military, and the military's role is to primarily police the occupation. So they have to engage in that kind of dehumanizing practices against Palestinians. And like you said, the media sort of goes along with this. And Gideon Levy is one of the only journalists who I've heard him interviewed, and he says once a week he goes to the West Bank and talks to Palestinians and then tries to write about it, because he says no one else, no other journalists and no other media in Israel are actually explaining what the occupation does to the Palestinians. And so that kind of, cutting off all contact, but also refusing to see the harm that the occupation is doing to Palestinians. Yeah, I believe it's dehumanizing Israelis themselves. It makes them more and more capable of committing atrocities without any regret or without any conscience. It's hardening their own conscience. And in a way diminishing their own humanity. And I think that's what violence does. That's what oppression and occupation does, particularly in a kind of apartheid style society. And I saw that firsthand myself, because I grew up in Africa, and I traveled to South Africa in the 1980s at the height of apartheid. And I saw it firsthand what that kind of separate society does to people, the way it dehumanizes, very much in Frantz Fanon's terms, the way it kind of scars and deeply violates the psyche of the colonial subject or the oppressed subject. And then, of course, you get the prison breakout of October 7, which comes as no surprise, because if that's what you do to people over decades, then in many ways that's what they become. It amazes me how they talk about Hamas and Hezbollah without acknowledging that both of those organizations were in many ways created by Israel's actions. They both arose in response to violent oppression as a form of resistance. to oppression. And in the case of Hamas, and we can talk about the funding. I mean, Israel actually helped fund Hamas because they wanted them to be a counterweight, a kind of divide and rule process, very much along the colonial lines, against the PLO. So at the beginning, they supported them. So, this is kind of blowback on that ground as well.
Yeah, I keep calling Hamas as Netanyahu's Frankenstein monster.
Right.
It is because coming to 2 points, like even right now, like I went to South Africa after the apartheid, but in Johannesburg, for example, I saw the kind of segregation which is still there. Like I stayed near to Emerentia Dam, and there I saw that I was not I was always given, guided that never take a van with the blacks. You'll be raped. You'll, some kind of theft will happen. Specifically, the generation of, in 1900s, the Indians from Gujarat who had migrated to Durban, to Johannesburg, to work in sugarcane plantations and many other plantations. They have now accumulated wealth and have higher socioeconomic privilege. And they believe that irrespective of the apartheid being over, the blacks are out for them. In fact, they are much more scared than the elite white of various Portuguese, Dutch ancestry, British ancestry. So that was something which was very fascinating for me, that how, this kind of attitude is still very rampant. The second point is also coming to, I have seen the kind of dehumanization that takes place of Palestinians for 8 hours when through the Allenby Bridge, crossing Jordan over to West Bank in the military checkpoint or the area. And 2 things which were very interesting for me to notice, that most of these IDF soldiers that are stationed at the checkpoints in West Bank, they are 18, 19-year-old kids. And they're taller, obviously, because of the genetic makeup. And all of them are in their military uniforms with the most sophisticated, iPhone, whatever they can have, or Samsung. And these are kids.
Mm.
They are not, but those at just the checkpoint between Jordan and West Bank, they are obviously those who have spent years in the military. And the way they frisk Palestinians, the way they take their luggage out, they throw everything on the floor. The way they touch their bodies, even if it is an old woman who is just returning from a daily wage labor from Jordan. The way they are humiliated. And for 8 hours I watched it and I was like, where am I and what is going on? And at the same time, I'm thankful that a lot of scholars I'm not calling specifically from Lebanon right now, because most of them are my friends and academics and they're not in the right mental state. And they keep sending me videos and photos of what is happening around them. And it really disturbs me. At the same time, I have friends in Israel who who were initially living near the borders with Gaza or West Bank. 100,000 of them who had they had to leave their homes and go to northern Israel in upper ground or underground chambers with their entire life in a suitcase and family. And they are completely suffering from post-traumatic stress. And that impacts me too, because it is inhuman. All these conditions are inhuman. My friends in West Bank, for example, he says that every night when we are having dinner, and the parents are elderly, every night when they're having dinner, the only discourse that takes place is, if Israel bombs us, we will die here. We are not going to leave our land. That is a conversation that takes place during dinner. But again, these are all geopolitics of emotions, that how they make you feel at that personal level. And these personal stories are not really talked about in the media. For example, I recently interviewed the head of West Bank, UNRWA, and he said that there's an 800-year-old Indian hospice in West Bank, which is giving shelter and hospitalized center and all of this to UNRWA refugees in West Bank. That hospice was established. It has a Sufi, Indian Sufi history, but it was established in 1200 AD. And this kind of narrative is seen also, against in the Indian discourse against Pakistan. That completely, like yesterday, I tried so hard to differentiate between the Pakistani state and civilians, and none of them were buying it, as if it's not true. And the entire, the dehumanization that has become like a colloquial terminology of othering people who are socioeconomically, racially, ethnicity-wise, language-wise, different. I'm not saying up or down, just different. And that brings me to our next question, sir, that how did Netanyahu, when he spoke at UNGA recently, and most of the delegates from the Arab countries left when he started speaking, he spoke something about the long arm of Israel. He also, as predicted, had his props like Iran is a curse and India is a blessing and all of that. So he's playing that card very well, and we are falling victim to it anyway. So the point is that how do you see that, this long arm of Israel that can reach anywhere? When is US eventually going to stop funding this long arm of Israel and its inhuman actions?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, because there is no doubt in my mind, and I think all analysts who are watching this can see that that Israel is very much able to do what it's doing because of US support, and the US has allowed Israel kind of like off the leash and decided that there are no red lines, whatever. And in a way, this is something of a puzzle. I mean, I've got colleagues who study US politics, and they're puzzled as well, because the United States is, daily losing its influence around the world, losing support. It's kind of burning through all of its social capital. But it doesn't get anything out of it. It's also, incredibly expensive. It's giving billions and billions and billions to Israel. Meanwhile, its own society suffers from poor infrastructure, and they can't defend themselves against the floods that come from these big hurricanes and so on and so forth. And yet they're giving billions and billions practically every week to Israel. At some point, that kind of economic cost is going to be a real hard thing to bear for American society and American politics. And yet, what are they getting out of it? I can't see, and neither can those who study U.S. politics. And you will have come across John Mearsheimer's talking a lot about this at the moment. I mean, the US is just making such a huge error in giving Israel such an open level of support without any use of coercion to rein it in. It can't even get it to support a ceasefire that it proposed. It's personally, I think that it's only going to be when the rest of the world truly puts into place a kind of BDS, boycott, disinvestment and sanctions regime on Israel, and that also starts to affect the United States as well. I think also if there was some major disruption to the US political system because so many people decided to vote on the Gaza issue rather than on the domestic political issues, that could push the US to using its coercion, its leverage rather, on Israel. And, some people have said the US doesn't have any leverage on Israel, but it clearly does. There's no question. And we've seen in the past under Obama, but also Reagan, the US able to rein Israel in and stop them by threatening to cut off all arms and threatening to cut off financial, military, and political diplomatic support. I mean, if the US did that, Israel would be finished. And they would acquiesce to whatever the US wanted them to do. So, yeah, at the moment, it's just such a puzzle to me why the US is persisting in this when it goes against all their interests. Wherever they go around the world from now on, they're going to find it hard to persuade countries to follow them, to do what they say, because, they've destroyed their reputation. So what do they get out of it? It's very hard to see. But, I talked about this on a podcast a few days ago, that the only optimism I have is that, very similar to what happened in South Africa, which again was an apartheid state supported by the United States, eventually it collapsed. Eventually they negotiated a settlement and they had free and fair elections, one person, one vote for everyone, right? And I am hopeful that one day that will happen in Palestine. There'll be a free and fair election, one person, one vote. The refugees will be allowed to return. Some kind of peace settlement will have taken place, and there'll be guaranteed rights for all the different minorities, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Druze, whatever. And they'll be able to, try and rebuild and find a way to reconcile and live together on that land. But I think it's only going to come through, a massive nonviolent effort of BDS.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that the so-called axis of resistance can militarily defeat, the Israeli settler state. Settler states only ever end in one of three ways. Either they completely destroy the indigenous people, like we did in New Zealand in a way, although they've come back and we now have that's a bad example. That's not the example. Australia, right? They pretty much destroyed the indigenous people, the United States, Canada, and some other places. Then there's cases that settler colonial states end when the settlers get defeated and they have to leave, like Algeria, or Zimbabwe, or Zambia and other places. Kenya. They decide to give up their project of controlling the state. And then there's those cases where the settlers and the indigenous people find a way to live together peacefully. And South Africa is one of them, and New Zealand is another. We have a treaty between, the Crown, the government, white society in a way, and the indigenous people, the Maori people. And that treaty then becomes the basis for the relationship and the kind of reparations that need to take place, the reconciliation that needs to take place. I mean, it's a long, slow process, and the settler state doesn't want to concede too much, and there's still a lot of racism, but there's some progress being made. So I think, these are the only ways it can happen. And I think in Israel, the settlers can't win, because unless they decide to, use a nuclear bomb or something and just kill all the Palestinians, which I think probably would cross a red line, but also they, wouldn't be feasible. They can't ever get rid of the Palestinians. They have to accept that the Palestinians are there to stay. And the Palestinians themselves have built a culture of resistance. They've lived there for hundreds of years. They're not going to leave. No matter what Israel does to them, they're not going to move. So Israel has to find a way to live with them. And then on the other side of it, I don't think the Palestinians and the axis of resistance can drive the Israelis out. They're just too militarily weak. that could never happen. So they also have to accept that the settlers are here to stay. So we have to find a way to kind of live with them. And that's why I think some kind of settlement, some kind of treaty, some kind of process that similar to the one that happened in South Africa needs to occur. And I think that BDS, I would say, offers the only realistic opportunity for that at the moment. And I think if we have a few more years of really putting economic pressure on Israel, I mean, to the point where their economy is about to collapse and they can't sustain their military forces. And, if we could convince the United States to either pull back its support or end it altogether, that will be, the last straw, I think. Then you would have to have some kind of negotiation and maybe a peacekeeping force or something in the initial stages before you could have free and fair elections, and take it from there.
Yeah.
But I think, looking at this in the long-term historical light, this BDS process is the thing that we should be concentrating on.
Yeah, that's very, in terms of one of the talks of Omar Barghouti that I attended and the BDS movement. So for the scholars, Omar Barghouti is he's the co-founder of Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement. He's also the founding committee member of Palestinian Campaign for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel that was established in 2004 in Ramallah. And even Maya Wind was there talking about the scholasticide which Israel is doing of the Gazan universities and those in West Bank and how it's going to impact. So, sir, now we'll have one question from one of our volunteers, and his name is Gaurang. How does this dehumanization impact of it have it on the conflict resolution process? For example, Jews were dehumanized for a very long time, not only during the time of Hitler or the Soviet pogrom, but the history of the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, the way they had to get out from the Holy Land which they had, and how they were scattered. The dehumanization that was seen during the Dreyfus affair in France, that how an army general who was just, because he was Jew, he was considered to be guilty of espionage, even if he wasn't. And those in the courtroom were chanting that death to the Jew, death to the Jew. And these are very strong dehumanization terms. But in spite of being dehumanized, they have taken it and in spite of being the victims, now they're creating more victims of their own, in the words of Edward Said, and specifically in the Zionist system. The same can be said about the Palestinians in this century for their dehumanization suffered. Could you explain how this affects negotiations?
Yeah, look, that's a great question and a great point to raise. From the perspective of conflict resolution, I would say that, dehumanization is probably a secondary challenge. It's a very real challenge. Both sides have dehumanized each other, and both sides have felt dehumanized and experienced dehumanization over a long period, which is obviously humiliating to them and, hardens their attitudes and makes them less willing to compromise. And that's always difficult. As you were speaking, I was just reminded about the South African negotiations that led to the release of Nelson Mandela and to elections and so on. And I remember hearing a talk by someone who was involved in these negotiations, who said that the humanization process by which the negotiators from the white Afrikaner government and the ANC found ways to meet each other outside of the negotiating chamber and go fishing together. And then they would tell each other stories about their children, and they realized that they had a lot in common. And they built a personal relationship based on a very strong humanization of each other that then allowed them to trust each other to be able to make compromises and negotiate, an arrangement that would guarantee the rights and protections of all. So I think it can happen, and I think it will happen. There's a lot of evidence from peace studies based on what's called contact theory, which is the idea that when you have more and more contact with the sort of out group, you under the right circumstances, if that contact, the kind of contact that you have is well thought out and structured, you can come to see the other side in a more human way and humanize them to the point where it's able to, where you're able to trust them enough in order to make compromises that are necessary in a peace process. But as I said, I think that's kind of a secondary challenge. I think the primary challenge is something that you hinted at, and that is the role of trauma. I think both sides, the Israelis from the trauma of the Holocaust, and in some ways, that trauma is kind of remembered and kind of practiced and recited, and all school children have to go to the Holocaust Museum, and they have histories, learn about it. And so it keeps it alive. That trauma is kept alive in Israel's cultural memory, but also the personal memories of all Israelis. And so every time they think about, the threats from Hamas or Hezbollah or any Palestinian or whatever, they're triggered. That trauma is triggered because they think, they want to just wipe us out. They want to throw us in the sea. They want to kill every Jew. And we can't allow that to happen. We have to do everything in our power to protect ourselves. And that trauma is just so present in Israeli society, but you can hear it also in Israeli politicians' language. That trauma is there all the time. And then on the Palestinian side, obviously the trauma from the Nakba is still there. The fact that Palestinian families still carry the keys to their houses that they were forced to flee from. And then also the trauma that they've experienced from 75 years of occupation, of being tortured, of being, bombed, of being put under siege, of having their houses demolished, of, and then particularly the genocide in Gaza that we're witnessing at the moment. This is all deeply traumatic. And so for them, it's going to be very difficult for them to trust Israel in a negotiation, because they'll be thinking, what if they decide to bomb us again? What if they decide to do another Nakba? So I think, this is the big obstacle that's going to need to be overcome in any kind of peace process, is how do you reassure two traumatized groups into trusting each other? And I think that's where the international community will have to come in. If the international community can provide guarantees, can provide support, and maybe, neutral peacekeepers who can keep an eye on things and guarantee the human rights of everyone and the protection of everyone, regardless of which community you belong to. I mean, yeah, there's a lot there that will need to be done in order to kind of facilitate a healing process, which will take generations. Once there's a free Palestine, where Jews and Palestinians live together, Israelis and Palestinians live together, it's going to take generations for the trauma, for the violence, the memories of violence, for the injustices to be resolved, for some level of reconciliation to happen. But yeah, it's the only option. I mean, the only other option is that Israel just lives on for the next few decades as a hyper-violent state trying to kill everyone who opposes them. And that's not going to give them any security or any peace. Eventually, their project will fail.
Yeah. In fact, when you were talking, sir, I was reminded of this Netflix mini-series that is available in India. It is called as Unorthodox. It was released in 2020. It is the story of basically it is the creation by the book by Deborah Feldman, Unorthodox, the Scandalous Rejection of My Hasidic Roots. And it talks about specifically a 19-year-old Jewish woman who is tied in an arranged, unhappy marriage in the Satmar sect of ultra-Orthodox community in Brooklyn, New York. And how she runs away from there to Berlin to learn music, learns how to play piano, and she's just 19 years old. And the process which she's able to recover from her own trauma, the trauma of not only the repetition of trauma that this ultra-Orthodox Jewish community does, but also the trauma of her own gender, of her own reality, of her own violence through music. And she's able to recover from, and it's a beautiful series because in one of those, dialogues, one of the members of, her brother-in-law comes over to Berlin to find her. And the hotel managers think that they are Israelis. So now this guy coming all the way from US says, no, Israelis are Zionists. I'm from US. So it was completely, and there's another Netflix series called Mo, which is about a Palestinian refugee whose parents were tortured when they shifted, had to migrate from Palestine to Iraq and, during Saddam Hussein and all of it. And they're trying to get asylum in US in spite of staying there for so many years. So there's a particular scene in which a Jewish guy and an Arab guy, they are playing cards. And they are doing banter with each other. So the Jewish guy says something to the Arab guy that, you're saying this, it is anti-Semitic. So the Arab guy looks up at him and says that, come on, I'm a Semite. Well, why will I say something anti-Semitic to you? And it was, so through humor, through dark humor, for those who understand the context, these are really very beautiful attempts of cinema.
Mm-hmm.
To recreate narratives where, there are so hardline cinematic presence of, terrorism, violence, far right, which is perpetrated by most of the film industries of many countries to create the other. So with this, sir, thank you so much for your time. And now I would like to welcome back Fayaz, who is going to formally thank you for the privilege of your time. Yes, Fayaz.
Yeah, ma'am. Hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
So thank you so much, Professor Richard Jackson. It was a profound and enlightening session we've just witnessed. On behalf of everyone present here, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Richard Jackson for his insightful discussion on the dehumanization of Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank. You've deeply illuminated the various facets of this harsh reality. And from this racist coloniality perpetuated by the state of Israel to the cruel de-evaluation of an entire people. So the stark contrast between the oppressed and the oppressor, shaped by violence, sectarian divides, and the narrative of civilizing missions, was powerfully dissected. The grim reality of Palestinians being reduced to faceless enemies of freedom, often subject to lethal treatment, reflects the negative dehumanization and cruel dehumanization that fuels ongoing conflict. And your analysis, sir, of this as part of a broader apartheid state where resistance is branded as terrorism was incredibly thought-provoking. And now I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary for her efforts in bringing such a remarkable voice from New Zealand onto this platform. Thank you for hosting this event and providing us the opportunity to hear from such an expert on this crucial subject. I once again thank you, Professor Jackson, for sharing your valuable knowledge, and Dr. Chaudhary for making this enlightening event possible.
Thank you.